The little-known story of a politician typically celebrated for his legacy of liberalism. Bobby Kennedy is remembered as a champion of the poor, pro-civil rights, anti-war, but few recall the staunch conservatism which marked his political infancy. That evolution is chronicled beautifully by New York Times bestselling author Larry Tye in his new book, Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal. Larry joins me now. Larry, good to see you. The book is fabulous. I thought I knew a lot about Bobby Kennedy. I did not, I should say. Let's go to the early Bobby Kennedy, about his relationship with the red-baiting Joe McCarthy. Was the young Kennedy a true believer in the cause?
He was a believer in two things: that any friend of his father's, Joe Kennedy, was a friend of his, and Joe McCarthy was a great pal of the father, and he truly believed in the anti-communist cause and thought Joe McCarthy was the only one in America who was out there doing what he ought to do to uncover communists.
You know, and when I read that, I said, well, I'm not sure I agree, not that I knew. It was opportunism, but then you tell the story about the funeral of McCarthy and Kennedy's, explain what happened that day.
So a plane comes into Green Bay, Wisconsin to bring all the dignitaries, 19 senators, 7 congressmen, lots of other important people from Washington. Everybody gets off. They take limousines that take them to nearby Appleton to the funeral of Joe McCarthy. After everybody's gone, the runway is empty. One guy comes down the exit chute, young guy, congressional aide named Bobby Kennedy. He makes sure that nobody is around. He bums a ride to town with a journalist who's covering the funeral for one of the Wisconsin newspapers. During the funeral, he's up in the choir loft. During the graveside service, he's off to the side so nobody can see him. After the funeral, he gets all the reporters to promise they will not mention that he was there. So we're seeing two things.
And they didn't, by the way. It was a different time.
Those were the days. He was a Kennedy. He asked them a favor, and they did it. And that shows to me two sides of Bobby Kennedy. One side was the guy who was incredibly loyal to his friend Joe McCarthy. Jack Kennedy told Bobby, don't go there. It will be embarrassing. Bobby went. And yet he was smart enough and political enough that he also went anonymously.
One more story before we go to the transition and what caused it to the Bobby Kennedy most of us knew. Bobby Kennedy wrote about how essentially he was the one who solved the Cuban Missile Crisis. But we learned from you he was also an instigator. Is that a fair description of what his role was early on?
He had two roles that he didn't talk about in his famous book, 13 Days.
Yeah.
One was that he had led, after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, he took that as a personal affront to his brother and to the administration, and he led something called Operation Mongoose, which was a clandestine war to do everything from sabotage the crops to try to assassinate Fidel Castro. And there's no question that the Russians went in with missiles, in part because they saw that there was a real war going on to displace Castro.
So did he have an epiphany at some point, or was it just a transition that was bound to come? What happened? What converted this Bobby Kennedy?
So I'm convinced there are always transitions that are partly smooth and partly have epiphanous moments. And for Bobby Kennedy, that moment was, if it was any single one, it was in November 1963. He and Ethel Kennedy are out by their pool on their estate in McLean, Virginia. The green box starts ringing, the phone, the hotline to the White House. J. Edgar Hoover is on the line and says, in a monotone voice, says to Bobby, the president's been shot. Less than an hour later, a call back and it says, the president has been killed. And Bobby Kennedy did two things after that happened. For the next month, he was the nation's mourner-in-chief. He pulled together the family, he kept Jackie and the 2 kids going, and when the country was in desperate shape, Bobby Kennedy lifted them up.
You're talking about particularly around the time of the assassination of Martin Luther King.
Well, actually, I'm talking still about the assassination of
his brother.
Of his brother, Jack Kennedy. And this is, so Jack Kennedy dies, Bobby keeps the country together for that next month.
Oh, that year, I see. Well, can we fast forward a little bit? I have to say, of all the inspirational moments, I saw him once on a street corner in Philadelphia where I grew up, and I'll never forget it. The one that I think stays with everybody is his speech in Indianapolis. Martin Luther King is killed. He wants to go into some pretty tough communities. Richard Lugar, then the mayor, goes on to be a senator, says, no, that's not for you. That's not the place to be. He says, that's where I belong. And here's part of that incredible speech by Bobby Kennedy.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in.
Boy, I'll tell you. And you write that neither he nor his brother John were particularly good communicators when they were young. Is that true?
It is true, and Bobby Kennedy, when he had to, he was magical. Can I tell you two things that
Sure.
happened as a result of that speech? So number one is he goes in and gives that speech, and on the one hand, everybody in the audience is devastated by the loss of King, and yet he was so empathetic, talking for the first time in his life about the loss of his brother, that the crowd also wanted to embrace him. And the magic of that moment was that in 100 cities across America that night of Martin Luther King's death, there were riots. One of the only cities with a large African-American community with no riot was Indianapolis. Fast forward to today, at a moment when we're going through Baton Rouge and St. Paul and Dallas, I think we need, Bobby Kennedy ad-libbed that speech. It was just 6 minutes. And we need somebody who can deliver a speech like that and bring people together in a way that he did magically that night.
We're going to hear more of those 6 minutes, including what you're talking about in just a couple of seconds. You know, when I knew you were coming in a week or so ago, I Googled how many books on Bobby Kennedy. It's like 100 or something. So I say, how daunting does that have to be? And then before I read the book, I actually read the New York Times interview. I shouldn't have done them in that order. And the reviewer says, breaks new ground, things you didn't know before. One of the things that caused the reviewer to be able to say that is Ethel Kennedy. You're the first biographer, Bobby Kennedy's wife. You're the first biographer with whom she's spoken at great length, right? What did we learn from Ethel that we didn't know before, Larry Ty?
So what Ethel let me do was test out every theory I had on Bobby Kennedy. The Kennedy defenders over the years had always said that his relationship with Joe McCarthy was an asterisk or a footnote. Ethel helped me understand that it was neither, that they were friends, that he may have been a monster to much of America, but he was a warm and charming guy to Bobby Kennedy. We learned everything about the friendship with Jack Kennedy. People would say that they would finish one another's sentences. Ethel said they didn't even have to talk. They had this kind of communication that they knew. It was the closest thing to a co-presidency that we've ever had and probably ever will.
Did she read the book?
She has now, and do I know what she thinks? I'm not quite sure. I hope that if I have faith in anybody to have read the good and the bad and to take it as a unit, it's Ethel Kennedy.
Before you go, his grandson, Joe Kennedy, the congressman, is going to be here on Tuesday night. I don't know, has he read the book? Do you know?
He has the book. He just got the book, and I hope he's
What
read
do you think of him?
So I think he is the closest thing that we have seen in the last 50 years in that family to a Bobby Kennedy, which to me is a great thing to be.
My goodness, Larry Ty, it's a wonderful book.
Great to
Thanks so
see you.
much for
Thank
spending
you.
time. I appreciate it. Book again is Bobby Kennedy, The Making of a Liberal Icon. And before we move on, here's more from that incredible night in Indianapolis.
What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another. Feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
As Larry said, as relevant now as it was 48 years ago.